She walked in, she sat down, and she started talking. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody had threatened her. Not in any way the record admits to anyway. She just began. And what came out of her mouth was so detailed, so specific, so strange, that the men in the room stopped interrupting and started writing everything down. This is Auldearn, Scotland, 1662. A woman named Isobel Gowdie is confessing to witchcraft. She describes flying. She describes feasting with the devil. She describes shape-shifting into a hare and the exact words you have to say to do it and the exact words to say to change back. She names names. She gives addresses. She describes crimes committed against specific neighbors in specific fields on specific nights. She does this 4 times, over 6 weeks, in front of ministers and a notary and at least a dozen witnesses. The notary writes it all down and notes at the top of the first page that she came forward without compulsion, willingly. The word he uses is voluntarily. We are going to spend some time with that word today because it is doing a lot of work, and because the question of why Isobel Gowdie said any of this, why she walked in, sat down, and started talking, is one that nobody has ever fully answered, including Isobel. Let's place her first. Auldearn is a small parish near Nairn on the Moray Firth in the northeast of Scotland. In 1662 it is a farming community. Isobel Gowdie is a cottar's wife, a cottar being a farm laborer who holds a cottage in exchange for work. She is illiterate. She has no property of her own. The records give no information about her life before her marriage to a man named John Gilbert, and John Gilbert, for his part, has no involvement in any of what follows. He just disappears from the story the moment it becomes interesting. We don't know how old Isobel is. Estimates range from her mid-teens to her 50s, which tells you exactly how much the record cared about pinning that down. We don't know what she looks like. Some later writers describe her as beautiful and red-haired, but no source for that description has been found. It seems to have been invented and then repeated until it felt true. What we do know is that she is, by every social measure available to her, unremarkable. A cottar's wife in a small parish in the Scottish northeast. And then, on the 13th of April, 1662, she starts talking, and she becomes one of the most documented individuals in the entire history of European witchcraft. Here is the world she is confessing into. Scotland in 1662 is coming out of one of its worst periods of witch hunting. Between the spring of 1661 and the autumn of 1662, roughly the 18 months bracketing Isobel's confessions, at least 664 people are accused of witchcraft across Scotland. That is not a typo. 664 people in 18 months. Of those, somewhere upward of 300 are executed. The method in Scotland is strangling at the stake, followed by burning. The strangling is the mercy. It happens first, before the fire. Not always, but usually. This is the context Isobel is confessing into. She is not confessing in a vacuum. She is confessing in a country that has been killing people for this, at scale, for the better part of a century, and is currently in the middle of one of its largest panics. The local ministers conducting her interrogation, a man named Harry Forbes and a man named Hugh Rose, are not neutral parties. They have preconceptions. They have a framework. They have questions they want answered, and the shape of those questions is visible in the shape of her answers. When did you make a pact with the devil? That kind of question. When did you fly to the witch's Sabbath? The confession was led. The record says so, if you read it carefully enough. The word voluntary is the first thing you have to deal with, and it is a trap. The notary John Innes writes at the top of the first confession that Isobel proceeded without any compulsatoris. Without compulsion. He uses the Latin-derived legal term. He means she was not tortured. And here is the thing. He may even be technically correct. Scotland in 1662 does use torture in witch trials. The brodequins, the leg-crushing boots, the thumb screws, sleep deprivation enforced by watchers who keep you awake for days. But the record does not show evidence of those instruments being used on Isobel Gowdie specifically. What the record also does not show is that she was free. She is in the toll booth in Aldern, the local jail. She is in solitary confinement. She is almost certainly being beaten. She is almost certainly being deprived of sleep, because sleep deprivation was not classified as torture. It was classified as keeping watch over a prisoner. She has been shaved and pricked for the witch's mark, which involves a long needle and the systematic violation of her body, and that is also not classified as torture. The line between voluntary and coerced in 1662 Scotland runs through a gap that is much narrower than the word voluntary implies. John Innes is writing a legal document. He is not writing a psychological assessment. There is another confession from this same period that helps you see the shape of what voluntary is doing. Nehemiah Wallington was an English Puritan, a London woodturner actually, who kept notebooks about everything that alarmed him, and a lot of things alarmed him. He writes about a witchcraft trial held in Chelmsford, England, in July 1645. 30 women on trial, 14 hanged, and Wallington records something that one of the accused, a woman named Rebecca West, says about her own confession. She confessed, she says, to sleeping with the devil. She did it, she says, because she found herself in such extremity of torture and amazement that she would not endure it again for the world. That is a coerced confession. That is what it looks like when someone says it plainly. Rebecca West tells you exactly why she said what she said. The contrast with Isobel Gowdie is interesting because Isobel never gives you that. She never says, I said this because they made me. She also never says, I said this because it is true. She just says it, all of it, 4 times, with a level of detail that goes well beyond what any interrogator's leading questions could have generated on their own. The detail is the thing that keeps stopping researchers, the sheer, extraordinary, specific detail. So let's talk about what she actually says. Because the content of these confessions is extraordinary, and not in the way a prosecutor in 1662 would have meant that word. She describes flying. The method is specific. You take a straw or a beanstalks, you place it between your feet, and you say, horse and haddock, in the devil's name, and then you fly. She says she and her coven used this to get into people's houses and steal food and drink while the household slept. She describes shape-shifting. To become a hare, she says, you recite a charm, she gives the words, and to change back, you recite another. She describes meeting the Queen of Faerie and the King of Faerie underground in a land that is neither heaven nor hell, but something else entirely. She describes feasting with the devil. She describes the devil himself, his appearance, his touch, his temperature. She gives the names of other coven members. She describes specific acts of maleficium, harmful magic, committed against specific people. She names a man whose land was blighted. She names a child who was made sick. She gives dates, or near enough. She gives locations. The historian Brian Levac calls her initial statement one of the most remarkable documents in the history of witchcraft. Julian Goodare calls her one of the most famous of all Scottish witches. They are not wrong. The document is remarkable. The question is, what it is a document of. The fairy material is worth staying with for a moment, because it is not what you expect to find in a witchcraft confession. Isobel does not describe the fairies as cute. She describes them as powerful, dangerous, and real. A parallel court with a queen and a king, existing underground, accessible to those who know how to find it. She says she has been there. She describes what it looks like. The fairy court in her testimony is not a metaphor, and it is not a children's story. It is a place she claims to have visited with the same matter-of-fact specificity she uses to describe flying over the rooftops of Aldern. This is significant because the fairy tradition and the witchcraft tradition are not the same thing, and they do not always sit comfortably together. Prosecutors in 1662 are interested in the devil. They are interested in the pact, the Sabbath, the maleficium. They are less interested in the fairy court because the fairy court does not fit neatly into their theological framework. And yet, Isobel keeps including it. Nobody asked her specifically about the fairy queen. She volunteers it, which means either the fairy material is something she genuinely believes, or it is something she is adding for reasons of her own, or it is something that is so deeply embedded in the folk culture of Aldern that she cannot tell her story without it. All three of those possibilities are interesting. None of them is simple. Modern academics who study Isobel Gowdie tend to describe her as a talented narrator with a creative imagination. That framing is careful and deliberate. It sidesteps the question of whether she believed what she was saying, because that question cannot be answered from the outside. What can be observed is that she is a skilled storyteller. The confessions have a structure. They have rhythm. They have the kind of internal consistency that suggests either genuine belief or genuine craft, and possibly both. She is illiterate, which means everything she knows orally. She has absorbed the stories of her community, the fairy lore, the charm traditions, the folk beliefs about illness, and blighted crops, and what you do about them, and she can reproduce them with a fluency and a richness that the educated men writing everything down clearly find astonishing. There is a moment in reading the confessions where you realize that the person in the room with the most knowledge is Isobel. The ministers have theology, the notary has Latin, but Isobel has everything else. The full, living, oral tradition of a farming community that has been managing its fears and its hopes through story and ritual for longer than anyone in that room can trace. She is not performing ignorance, she is performing fluency, and the men writing it down are so busy recording the devil content that they almost miss what they are actually holding. The confessions happen 4 times. April 13th, a second session, a third, and a fourth on May 27th, 1662. 6 weeks of interrogation. Each session produces more material. She does not retract. She does not contradict herself in ways that suggest she is making things up on the spot and losing track. She adds. She elaborates. She circles back to earlier claims and extends them. This is not the pattern of someone saying whatever comes to mind to make the questioning stop. It is the pattern of someone with a story they want to tell, or a story they have told themselves so many times it has become solid. The interrogators are led by Harry Forbes, the local minister, and Hugh Rose. At least a dozen witnesses are present. John Innes, the notary, takes everything down. The procedure is formal. It is a legal proceeding. Isobel is not being interviewed informally. She is being deposed in front of witnesses with a record being made. And she keeps going. 4 times. 6 weeks. The sheer duration of it is one of the things that distinguishes her case from most witch trial confessions, which tend to be shorter, more formulaic, more obviously shaped by the interrogator's questions. Isobel's confessions are shaped by the questions too, but there is material in them that the questions did not generate. That surplus is what everyone keeps coming back to. Here is a theory about why she came forward, and it is the closest thing to an explanation the historical record offers. The historian John Callow, who wrote Isobel's entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, suggests she may have been involved in a conspiracy, a real one, a social one, to torment Harry Forbes, the local minister. Forbes was, by the accounts we have, a zealous extremist. He was afraid of witchcraft. He preached about it. He was the kind of man who made enemies in a small community, and small communities have ways of making life difficult for people they have decided to dislike. Callow's hypothesis is that Isobel's confession, with its detailed accusations against named neighbors, may have been partly a vehicle for settling local scores, and that Forbes himself, the man conducting her interrogation, may have been one of the targets of whatever social conflict she was embedded in. This is speculative. Callow is careful to frame it as a hypothesis, but it has the texture of something plausible because it is the kind of thing that happens in small communities under pressure. The witch trial as a mechanism for resolving local disputes that have no other outlet. The confession as a weapon. The voluntary statement as the most aggressive move available to a woman with no property, no status, and no other leverage. The question of why people confess to witchcraft voluntarily, without the kind of physical torture that explains Rebecca West's confession, is one that historians have been working on for a long time. And the answer, when you look at the full record, is that there is not one answer. There are several, and they operate at different levels. Some people confessed because they genuinely believed they had done what they were accused of. The belief systems of early modern Europe allowed for that. If you believed that illness could be caused by maleficium, and you had wished illness on a neighbor, and then the neighbor got sick, the line between wishing and doing was not always clear. Some people confessed because the social pressure of interrogation by ministers in front of witnesses in a community that already suspected them was unbearable even without physical pain. Some people confessed because confession was the only way to be heard. To have your story taken seriously, to be, for the first and possibly the only time in your life, the most important person in the room. That last one is uncomfortable to sit with, but it is documented. And it may be part of what is happening with Isobel Gowdie, whose confessions are so detailed, so elaborated, so clearly the product of someone who has things to say and is finally saying them, that the possibility cannot be dismissed. Let's stay with the charms for a moment, because they are remarkable objects in themselves. Isobel gives the words, the actual words, in Scots phonetically as John Innes could transcribe them. The flying charm, horse and haddock, in the devil's name. The hair charm, she gives the full verse, the transformation sequence, the reversal. These are not things a prosecutor would have invented and then put in her mouth, because they are too specific and too folkloric and too far from the theological framework the prosecutors are working within. These are things from somewhere else, from the living oral tradition of the Moray Firth coast. Charms like these circulated in early modern Scottish communities. They were used for healing, for protection, for managing the uncertainty of agricultural life, a bad harvest, a sick cow, a difficult birth. The charm tradition was not secret exactly. It was just not the church's business, and the church increasingly wanted it to be. What Isobel is doing, in part, is giving the interrogators a window into a world that existed alongside the official religious world, and that the official religious world had been trying to stamp out for a century. She is, possibly without meaning to, providing one of the most detailed surviving records of Scottish folk practice in the 17th century. The historians who came after her owe her something for that, even if they cannot agree on what. The pricker. This is a figure who appears in Scottish witch trials and who deserves a moment. A pricker was a man, always a man, who was employed to find the witch's mark. The theory was that the devil, when he made his pact with a witch, left a mark on her body, a spot that felt no pain and did not bleed when pierced. The pricker's job was to find that spot, using a long needle, by systematically piercing the accused's body until he found a place that produced no reaction. this was done. It was done to women, in front of witnesses, as a legal procedure. It was not classified as torture. In 1662, a pricker named Patterson was working the stretch of coast from Inverness to Elgin. Aldern sits squarely between those two towns. The fact sheet is careful here. There is no documented record of Patterson examining Isobel Gowdie specifically. The geography makes it almost certain he was in the area, but almost certain is not documented, and the record does not confirm it. What the record does confirm is that the witch's mark examination was standard procedure in Scottish witch trials of this period, and that it involved the kind of physical violation that, again, was not classified as torture. The legal category of voluntary is doing a great deal of work in a room where this is happening. There is a version of Isobel Gowdie's story that became very famous in the 20th century, and it is almost entirely wrong. Margaret Murray was a British Egyptologist who turned her attention to witchcraft in the 1920s and developed a theory that the witches of early modern Europe were the remnants of a pre-Christian fertility cult, a real, organized religion that had survived underground and that the church had systematically persecuted. Isobel's confessions were central to Murray's argument. The coven structure, the Sabbath, the ritual details. Murray read all of it as evidence of an actual surviving cult. She argued that covens were organized in groups of 13, and she used Isobel's testimony as a data point. Murray's theory was taken seriously for decades. It influenced Wicca. It influenced popular culture. It influenced the way people thought about witchcraft for most of the 20th century. It is also, as the scholarly consensus now firmly holds, wrong. The details in Isobel's confession that look like evidence of an organized cult look that way because the interrogator's questions were designed to find an organized cult. The 13-member coven figure comes from Murray's analysis, not from an independent reading of the primary record. The folk tradition Isobel is drawing on is real. The organized pan-European fertility cult is not. What the scholarly consensus does hold, and this is worth being precise about, is that the folk beliefs Isobel describes are real folk beliefs. The fairy tradition is real. The charm tradition is real. The belief in shape-shifting is real in the sense that it was genuinely held by real people in early modern Scotland. The question is not whether Isobel invented all of this. She did not. She is drawing on a living tradition. The question is what relationship she has to that tradition. Is she a practitioner? A believer? Someone who grew up surrounded by these stories and absorbed them so completely that she can reproduce them with total fluency? Or is she someone who has been asked repeatedly, what do witches do? And is answering from the same folk tradition that her interrogators are partly drawing on, because it is the only shared vocabulary available? The honest answer is that we cannot know. The record does not tell us what Isobel privately believed. It tells us what she said in a specific room, in front of specific people, under specific conditions. The distance between what she said and what she believed is exactly as wide as the distance between any person's public statement and their private conviction, which is to say, possibly very wide, possibly not wide at all, and not something we can measure from the outside. Here is something the confessions do that is unusual, and that tends to get lost in the discussion of their folkloric content. Isobel names people, real people, neighbors. She names them as fellow coven members. She describes specific acts of maleficium committed by specific individuals against specific victims. In doing this, she is not just confessing to her own supposed crimes, she is accusing other people of crimes. In the legal framework of 1662 Scotland, an accusation from a confessed witch is evidence. It is not sufficient evidence on its own, but it is enough to open a case. The people Isobel names are in danger. Some of them are arrested. The confession is not a private spiritual exercise. It is a legal document with real consequences for real people in a real community. This is part of what makes the question of why she came forward so charged. If she was settling scores, if the Callow hypothesis has any truth to it, then the confession is also a weapon. A woman with no property, no status, no legal standing of her own, sitting in a jail cell, is naming names in front of a notary and a dozen witnesses. Whatever else is happening, she is making things happen. She is moving pieces on a board that she is not supposed to be able to touch. Compare her to the typical profile of a Scottish witch trial accused in this period. The accused is usually a woman, usually older, usually poor, usually someone who has already been suspected by her community, someone whose neighbors have been watching her, avoiding her, attributing misfortunes to her for years before the formal accusation arrives. She does not come forward. She is brought forward. She denies it, or she admits it under pressure, or she admits some of it and denies the rest. Her confession, when it comes, tends to be shorter, more formulaic, more obviously shaped by the questions she is being asked. She names accomplices when pressed, because naming accomplices is sometimes a survival strategy. It shifts attention, it creates complexity, it buys time. Isobel fits some of this profile and not others. She is poor, she is a woman, but she comes forward. She is not brought, and her confession is not short or formulaic. It is long, elaborated, specific, and full of material that the questions did not generate. She is, in the taxonomy of witch trial confessions, an outlier. And outliers in historical records are interesting precisely because the record was not designed to preserve them. The devil, in Isobel's testimony, is a physical presence. He has a body. He has a temperature. She describes the cold of his touch. He has a voice. He officiates at the Sabbath, which has a structure: gathering, worship, feasting, dispersal. Isobel describes the food at the Sabbath. She describes the music. She describes who was there and where they stood. The devil in her testimony is not an abstraction. He is a man at a party, and the party has a guest list and a menu. This is consistent with the broader European witchcraft mythology of the period, but the specific texture is Isobel's own. The cold touch, for instance, is a detail that appears in other confessions, but Isobel's description of it is immediate and physical in a way that suggests either genuine sensory memory of something or a very good storyteller's instinct for the convincing particular. The theologians in the room would have recognized the Sabbath framework. The specific sensory details are harder to account for. They could be invention, they could be dream, they could be the product of sleep deprivation and isolation in a dark cell. They could be, as the ergotism hypothesis suggests, though it is only a local suggestion, not a confirmed diagnosis, the product of hallucinations caused by contaminated grain. None of these explanations is satisfying on its own. All of them are possible. The 1661 to 1662 Scottish witch panic is worth understanding in its full scale, because Isobel's confessions do not exist in isolation. They exist inside a mass event. Scotland has a long history of witch prosecution, but this particular outbreak is one of the largest. The 664 accused in 18 months are spread across the country. This is not one community's panic, but a national one, driven by a combination of political instability, religious anxiety, and the kind of social pressure that builds when communities have been under stress for a long time and need somewhere to put it. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 has just reshuffled the political and religious order. The church is reasserting itself. Local ministers like Harry Forbes are exactly the kind of zealous figures who thrive in that reassertion. Men who have a theological framework for explaining misfortune and a community that is primed to believe them. Isobel's confessions land in the middle of all of this. She is one of hundreds of cases being processed simultaneously. The Privy Council in Edinburgh issues commissions authorizing trials across the country. The machinery is running. And into that machinery walks a cottar's wife from Aldern who has apparently things to say. The Commission. A commission from the Scottish Privy Council authorized Isobel's trial, alongside a woman named Janet Bredhead, who was named as an accomplice. This is the formal legal mechanism. The Privy Council, sitting in Edinburgh, issues a document authorizing local authorities to try specific individuals for witchcraft. The commission is the paper trail. It establishes that the case was real, that it was processed through the legal system, that it was not an informal mob action. And then the paper trail stops. No verdict survives. No execution record survives. For Isobel Gowdie, who produced one of the most detailed witchcraft confessions in Scottish history, we do not know what happened to her. This is not unusual. In 90% of Scottish witch trials, the outcome is unknown because the records no longer exist. The records that survive are the ones that happen to survive. The ones that were kept, copied, preserved by accident or intention. The ones that didn't survive are gone. Isobel's outcome is in that gap. She probably died. The usual practice was execution, strangling, then burning. She may have been one of the 300 or more executed in this outbreak. Or she may have been released. It has been suggested, though not confirmed, that she returned to the obscurity of her former life. We do not know. The record that was so meticulous about what she said is silent about what happened to her after she said it. The confessions disappear into the archive. For 170 years they sit in the Scottish legal records, unread by anyone who is going to write about them. And then, in 1833, a historian named Robert Pitcairn transcribes and publishes them. This is the moment Isobel Gowdie enters the broader historical record. Pitcairn is working on a collection of Scottish criminal trials, and the Gowdie Confessions are among the most remarkable things he finds. He publishes them in full, in Scots, with notes, and from that publication the story begins to travel. Scholars read it, folklorists read it. Margaret Murray reads it and builds her discredited theory on it. Poets read it. Composers read it. The confessions acquire an afterlife that Isobel could not have anticipated, and that the men who took them down certainly did not intend. They intended to document a crime. What they actually documented was a woman's voice, strange, specific, fluent, and utterly unlike anything else in the record. The 1833 publication is the hinge point. Before it, the confessions are a legal document in an archive. After it, they are literature, evidence, folklore, and a problem that nobody has fully solved. In 1990, the Scottish composer James Macmillan wrote an orchestral work called The Confession of Isobel Gowdie. It premiered at the BBC Proms and was received as a major work, one of the most significant pieces of Scottish classical music in decades. Macmillan has spoken about the piece as an act of memorialization. He wanted to give Isobel something, a formal acknowledgement, a public voice, a piece of music that took her seriously. The work is not a recreation of the confessions. It is a response to them. It is also, in a way, a response to the silence at the end of the record, the missing verdict, the missing execution order, the missing evidence that anyone in 1662 thought her life was worth documenting beyond what she could tell them. Macmillan's piece has been performed around the world. It is, at this point, probably the most widely heard thing associated with Isobel Gowdie's name. A cottar's wife from Aldern, illiterate, of low social status, who walked into a room in 1662 and started talking, is now the subject of a celebrated orchestral work that has been played in concert halls on multiple continents. The distance between those two things, the toll booth in Aldern and the Royal Albert Hall, is one of the stranger journeys in Scottish cultural history. We keep coming back to the same question, and we are going to keep not answering it, because not answering it is the honest position. Why did she come forward? Here is the full range of what the record permits us to consider. She may have believed everything she said. The folk tradition she is drawing on was real to the people who held it, and there is no reason to assume Isobel was an exception. She may have been involved in a local conflict, the Forbes hypothesis, and used the confession as a vehicle for that conflict. She may have been so broken by isolation, sleep deprivation, and the systematic violation of the witch's mark examination that she was saying whatever came to mind. And what came to mind was the folk tradition she had absorbed over a lifetime. She may have wanted to be heard. She may have wanted for once to be the most important person in the room. She may have had reasons we cannot reconstruct, because the record does not preserve them. She may have had reasons she could not have articulated herself. All of these are possible. None of them is mutually exclusive. Human beings confess to things for multiple reasons simultaneously, and the reasons are not always legible, even to the person confessing. The record gives us what she said. It does not give us why. That gap is the thing that makes Isobel Gowdie's story so durable. The Confessions were first published in 1833 by Robert Pitcairn. They have been studied, cited, and quoted in academic work on witchcraft, folklore, and Scottish history for nearly 2 centuries. Brian Levac's description of the initial statement as one of the most remarkable documents in the history of witchcraft is a considered scholarly judgment, not hyperbole. Julian Gooder's description of Isobel as one of the most famous of all Scottish witches, whose confessions include some of the most remarkable visionary activities on record, is the same. These are people who have read a lot of witchcraft documents. When they use words like remarkable, they mean it in the specific sense of, this is not like the others. The others are formulaic or short, or obviously shaped entirely by the interrogator's questions. Isobel's confessions are long, elaborated, internally consistent, and full of material that the questions did not generate. They are also, and this is the thing that keeps pulling people back, written down by someone who was clearly astonished. John Innes, the notary, is transcribing as fast as he can. The document has the texture of someone trying to keep up with a speaker who is going faster than expected. That is a small detail, but it is the kind of detail that makes a document feel real. Let's think about what it was like to be a neighbor of Isobel Gowdie in Aldern in the spring of 1662. She has been in the toll booth for some weeks. Word is out that she is talking. The community is small enough that everyone knows everyone. The people she is naming are people you see at the market, people whose children play with your children, people whose fields are adjacent to yours. And she keeps naming them. 4 sessions, 6 weeks, more names, more details, more accusations. The community is eating itself, the way communities do in a witch panic. The accused become accusers. The accusers become suspected. The ministers are running interrogations. The Privy Council Commission is in place. The machinery is moving. In this environment, the voluntary confession is not just a personal act. It is a social event. It reshapes the community around it. The people who are named have to respond. Their families have to respond. The neighbors who are not named have to decide what they believe and what they say about what they believe. Aldern in the spring of 1662 is a community under a kind of pressure that does not have a modern equivalent exactly. The nearest thing is probably the dynamics of a McCarthyite hearing, where the names you give and the names you don't give determine who survives and who doesn't. Harry Forbes and Hugh Rose, the 2 ministers conducting Isobel's interrogation. Forbes is the one Callow's hypothesis points to as a possible target of whatever social conflict Isobel is embedded in. He is described in the sources as a zealous extremist with a specific fear of witchcraft. That is the kind of description that gets attached to a man who preaches about witchcraft frequently and with intensity. A man who has made his anxiety about the devil visible to his congregation, which means he has made his pressure points visible. Hugh Rose is less documented in the sources available. Together, they are the men in the room with the most official authority. They are also, in a sense, the men with the most to gain from a successful prosecution. A confession confirms their worldview, validates their authority, and demonstrates that the threat they have been preaching about is real. They are not neutral. They have a stake in what Isobel says, and yet, what she says keeps exceeding what they need. They need a pact with the devil, a Sabbath, some maleficium. She gives them all of that and then keeps going. The fairy court, the charms, the shape-shifting, the feasting. She gives them more than they asked for. That surplus is the thing that is hard to explain if you assume she is simply telling them what they want to hear. Here is the thing about the historical record that you have to hold in your head whenever you are working with cases like this one. The record preserves what it was designed to preserve. The Scottish witch trial records were designed to document crimes. They were not designed to document women's inner lives, or folk belief systems, or the social dynamics of small agricultural communities. The fact that we can reconstruct any of that from the Gowdie Confessions is an accident, a product of the unusual detail in her testimony and the unusual care with which John Innes transcribed it. Most of the women accused in the 1661 to 1662 panic left no comparable record. We know they were accused. We know in some cases that they were executed. We do not know what they said, or what they believed, or what their communities look like from the inside. The record is a sieve, and what falls through the sieve is gone. Isobel Gowdie is one of the things that didn't fall through, not because anyone intended to preserve her, but because her confessions were remarkable enough that a notary wrote them down carefully, and then they survived in an archive for 170 years until Robert Pitcairn found them. Survival is not the same as significance, but it is what we have to work with. The last documented moment of Isobel Gowdie's life is May 27th, 1662, the fourth confession. John Innes writes it down. The session ends. And then, nothing. The commission authorizing her trial exists. The confessions exist. The record of her interrogation exists. What does not exist is a verdict. What does not exist is an execution record. What does not exist is any document that tells you what happened to the woman who walked into a room and started talking and did not stop for 6 weeks. In 90% of Scottish witch trial cases, the outcome is unknown. Isobel Gowdie is in that 90%. The most documented witch in Scottish history, possibly in European history, for the sheer volume and detail of her testimony, and we cannot tell you whether she lived or died. The probability is that she was executed. The strangling and the burning were the standard outcome for a confessed witch in Nairnshire in 1662. But the record does not confirm it. She may have been released. She may have gone home to John Gilbert and his cottage and lived out the rest of her life in the obscurity she started in. We do not know. The record stops. She does not. What the confessions of Isobel Gowdie are, in the end, is a document of a voice. Not a document of witchcraft, not a document of the devil, not a document of a cult or a conspiracy or a crime. A document of a woman talking in extraordinary detail with extraordinary fluency about a world that her community believed in and that she had absorbed completely. Talking in front of men who were writing everything down and who thought they were documenting her guilt. Talking 4 times over 6 weeks in a way that suggests she had more to say than anyone expected, possibly including herself. The historian Julian Goodare calls her confessions some of the most remarkable, visionary activities on record. Brian Levac calls the first statement one of the most remarkable documents in the history of witchcraft. James Macmillan wrote a concert piece for her that has been performed at the BBC proms and in concert halls across the world. Robert Pitcairn found her in an archive in 1833 and put her back into the record. And before all of them, before the scholars and the composers and the archivists, there was John Innes sitting in a room in Aldern in April 1662, writing as fast as he could while the cotter's wife told him things he had not asked to hear. She said it all without compulsion. The record notes, willingly. Whatever that word means. She said it. Isobel Gowdie walked into a room in 1662 and started talking. 4 confessions over 6 weeks. Flying on straws. Feasting with the devil. The fairy court underground. The cold touch. The hair charm and the words to reverse it. All of it written down by a notary who noted at the top of the first page that she had not been compelled. And then the record stops, and she is gone, and we are left with the document and the question and no satisfying answer to either. That is the thing about cases like this one. The archive gives you the voice and takes away the ending. You get what she said. You do not get why. If you have a theory, a genuine one, based on something you know about early modern Scotland, or folk belief, or the psychology of confession, or anything else, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. Not she was crazy, and not she was telling the truth. Those are not theories. Those are exits. A real theory engages with the surplus. The material she gave them that they didn't ask for. That is the thing we're thinking about. And if this kind of story is the kind of story you want more of, cases where the record is real, and the answer is genuinely uncertain, and the person at the center of it is more interesting than the crime they were accused of, then subscribe. That is what this channel is. See you on the next one.